Alright, welcome back to this series of clustering implementation. We have successfully created our cluster on the Windows level, but there's still much more work to do. Alright, so to get on with this session, this is what we intend to achieve in this particular video. So first of all, we want to have an overview of the console, the cluster console. Then we want to test failover just to ascertain that what we've implemented is actually working, and we would like to understand what quorum configuration is and implement a file share witness quorum. So for the intent of what we're trying to do, the best and recommended quorum to implement is the file share witness quorum. There are a few more options, and we'll go into each of them to explain and understand what they mean. All right, so let's get into the primary server. I've got it open. First thing I want to do, as you can see, we're in the server manager, which you can bring up by clicking on the button right here, and you could just go to tools and get up the failover cluster manager console up. One thing I do want you to bear in mind is, we had some warnings and errors after creating the cluster, but that's okay. And the reason I would say okay is because, first of all, it's not your role per se to create the Windows cluster, because you're a DBA, not a sysadmin, and this is not a Windows system administration course. So there are certain warnings and errors that you can ignore for the sake of this training. But if you're tasked to do this, you wouldn't ignore. So ensure that you research on Google, and as much as possible try to remove all the errors that you see. But after going through, as you can see, we now have errors counting up to 101 and warning up to 8. But 101 errors that's come up later on is just a repetition. So if you have a look, you can see the same error is being repeated, and this has got to do with some DNS networking issue. So on a good day or in the real world, you have to work closely with the network administrators to do this, because this is not just a one-person work. So as a DBA, you wouldn't be expected to, you wouldn't even have access to some of the things that you need to do to get it to work. So for example, this is a DNS related error, and you have to troubleshoot and fix it getting onto the DNS server. But as a DBA, you most likely wouldn't even have access to the DNS server. But in our own case, we have the DNS server running on the domain controller, and we'll go there, we'll have a look at what it is, just to have an idea of what's going on. But for the sake of this training, you can completely and safely ignore all of this going on. So what I intend to do basically is just to walk you through a bit of the components of this console. So for example, you can see here this button right here says roles. We don't have any roles right now, but we will have roles by the time we get onto SQL Server. Nodes, we have implemented primary and secondary. Both of them are up, and you can see the votes assigned to them. By the time we start talking about quorum, you understand more about the votes, what we mean by the vote. And storage, we haven't implemented any storage at all. So if we had implemented one, you would have found it come up here. And networks, so we do have 2 network adapters implemented. So cluster network 1, cluster network 2, both of them are up, and everything seems green right there. Okay, so here's the thing. If you intend to do a number of things, most of the time will be to right click on a particular node. So for example, you want to do something on the cluster itself, you can right click and see a lot more options. If you want to do something with let's say the nodes, for example, you can right click. If you want to add node to the cluster, you can do that by coming to this here, and it's just as easy as selecting that and put the name of the server. If you follow the wizard, you put the name of the server and just follow the wizard, and you get the extra node added on top of it. If you go on for storage as well, you can see it doesn't really have much here, but we don't have any disk configured. So if you wanted to do with something with disk, like add disk, move available storage and things like that, that's also possible with pools. So basically you can go through each of these ones and right click and see all the options that there are. So let's just quickly go through the one on the cluster level itself. So if you want to configure role, you could do that by manually configuring role, but in our own case, SQL Server is actually going to do the role configuration for us, so we wouldn't have to come here to do anything. If you want to validate the cluster, so for example, you already have the cluster running, but you just want to see the configuration and more or less run the test that we ran before if you want to run it again. So if I click on validate cluster, hit next, you can see here run all tests. So let's say, like, you can see from the error log that there are DNS and network related errors coming up. So if you wanted to just out of curiosity see whether there's something wrong with the network, you can select run only test selected, and you can just uncheck these ones, leave out the network, and basically run the test. So if you hit next, you'd see it will go through the test, right? So I'll close out of that, so we don't intend to do that again. Carrying on, so that's for validate cluster. So if you want to view the report, you can as well do that. Remember I said if you forgot to save the report before, you can do that by just hitting on this, and as you can see we have some networking issues going on here. Okay, and what else? If you want to add node, you can do that from there as well. Close connection, and you'll probably spend more time with more actions. So when we are set to configure our quorum, this is where we're going to come. You want to copy the cluster roles, you want to shut down the cluster, destroy the cluster, move core resources. So for example, there are certain resources on a particular node, you want to move it to another node, you can use this option here. So you can either select a node or best possible node. In our own case, there's only one node, so at the moment the current host server is secondary and this is passive, it's there, so you can just select it and then copy the resources onto that. And what else do we have? Cluster aware updating. This is a Windows failover cluster feature where in a situation where you want to update the Windows server, for example, if you don't disable automatic update, what happens is when there are new patches or hot fixes, Windows Update will automatically apply these, right? But if it's something that you do manually, so best practices for servers would be to disable that, so that certain hot fixes and patches that you're not interested in would not automatically be applied. So in a situation where you want to do this manually for yourself, you wouldn't do that on each of the servers simultaneously, because this is a cluster and one has to be active at a point in time, and there will be need to restart the server. So what will happen is this feature enables the update to happen on the secondary first, shuts down and restarts the server, and automatically fails over onto the updated server, and then applies the patch on the primary, and when that's done, it flips back onto the primary. So it's just a nice way of doing this kind of updating without the users experiencing any downtime whatsoever. So this is basically an overview of the console. So if you wish to explore more, please feel free to do so, and you can see all the actions on the right hand side as well. Right, okay, so let's quickly test our failover. So we're currently on the current host is secondary, so let's see what happens if we shut down the secondary. So let's go to secondary, Let's log in. And let's just shut down this server. So the expectation is, because the secondary is the current active, right? So you can see instantly it has switched onto primary, and if I go to nodes, you see what's going on. Secondary is down because we've shut it down. The moment you hit the shutdown button, or for some reason something happened, you know, if it's a physical server and it's plugged to the electricity, if someone trips over the wire, or the computer gets turned off, or for whatever reason, instantly the cluster technology is aware of what's going on and it switches over. So basically what happens is, this is the computer name for the cluster. This 3x bank cluster is where people would connect to, is where the application will connect to. You're not connecting to primary or secondary, you're connecting to 3x. So what happens is, as secondary was active, 3x bank cluster is getting resources from that and giving it to whoever is connecting to it. The moment secondary goes down and it's now primary, 3x bank cluster will start talking to primary. So people don't even know what's going on behind the scene, right? So this is just what's going on, you know. So let me prove to you that this 3x bank cluster is seen as a computer. All right, it's a virtual resource. It's a computer on its own. It's just virtual. So it's just a computer that has these two servers behind it, and it's serving requests from the active server basically. So if we go to the domain controller, so let me bring up MSTSC from within the primary server and connect to the domain controller. It's called AD, that's the name I gave it. So you could have given yours anything, it doesn't matter, as long as you know what your domain controller is. Now we're into the domain controller. I'm going to bring up the server manager and then bring up the DNS tool. So if you click on tools and go to DNS. So if you don't know what DNS is, DNS means domain name server. So what it does is it resolves IP addresses to names. So you give a name to a computer is being identified with its IP address, right? So if you give a name to a computer and you try to access that name, what happens is the DNS server resolves that name to the IP address. So that's why you can go to www.facebook.com and it goes straight to the computer hosting the application called Facebook. But the computer itself understands only the numbers, not the name. So DNS is in charge of doing that resolve. So in our own case, we have implemented a cluster and we've given it a name, 3x bank cluster. That's the virtual name for that cluster. So a DNS record has to exist in the domain controller so that when you try to access the name of that cluster, it resolves it to the IP address of that cluster. So now we're into the DNS manager on the domain controller, and what we want to look for is this Active Directory xpoint.internal domain controller. So if you double click on that, you would see all the DNS records that are there. So in our own case, you can see 3x bank cluster is there. You can see all the computers when we join a computer to the domain controller, it puts these records here. The primary is there, the secondary is there. These are other servers in my environment. Priority 1, 2, 3, 4. This is another one. This is the Windows Server failover cluster itself. Remember, we gave it the IP address 130, and 3xBAN cluster. We gave it the IP address 140, which is 192.168.1.40. Right, so it's resolving this name to this IP address, right? So this is one way to see and know that the virtual cluster name itself is being represented as a computer. So another way to prove that is, let's go into the server manager and go to Active Directory, users and computers. So the first one I showed you is the DNS records that shows how the name of the computer is being mapped to the IP address. Now this is the Active Directory where it keeps the record for the users and computers. So in the case of users, remember this is where we created our user. So for example, primary SQL admin that we used to log on to the primary server. This is for the secondary. This is another user here. You can basically create new user by right clicking on new users and new user. Yep, you can do that. So in the case of computers, you can see here, these are the list of computers. So 3xBAN cluster is actually seen as a computer, but if you look at the description, it says failover cluster virtual computer name account, right? And that goes for the same Windows Server failover cluster itself. So this is automatically being handled by creating using the wizard to create it. You don't have to do anything, but showing you is just a way of saying, hey, these are the things that are happening behind the scene, so you understand conceptually what's going on when you create your cluster. All right, so as we're running out of time, let's quickly have a look at what we've done so far. So we've had an overview of the console with test failover. Now we need to understand the quorum configuration, so and implement file share witness. So what is a quorum? In a layman language, you understand that quorum is the number of members of a group that must be present to conduct business. So for your cluster to continue working as a cluster, there has to be a number of members. The members are the computers, the servers that has been added onto the cluster, right? So how many of these computers must exist for the cluster itself to continue working? All right, that's basically what this is saying. So in our own case, we have 2 computers, okay, and if we add one more, we have 3. So the formula that that Windows use to identify, how do I determine whether to continue running the cluster service or not, is it's very simple. It's just half. So it's half of the members plus 1 will give you required quorum to continue. So what this is saying is, if you have 2, so let's say in our own case we have 2 computers, right? So 2 divided by 2, because what we're looking for is half, or rather, let me put it this way: half of members plus 1 equals so this is basically what we need, half. Yeah. So if we have 2, and usually it rounds it up, so if we have 2, for example, so 2 divided by 2 is 1, so we need 1 plus 1 to continue, and 1 plus 1 is 2. So what that means is if we have just one computer running, that means we're not in a good shape to continue running the cluster. That's basically what this means. So in a situation where all we have is just 2 computers in a cluster, it doesn't make sense to leave it that way, because if one fails, then we are going to be in an inconsistent state. So that's where other kinds of quorum configuration comes in, like the file share witness that we've been talking about, and node and majority. We'll have a look at them in a minute. So for example, again, if you had 3 divided by 2 plus 1, so what happens is it rounds it up. So let's say, for example, 5 divided by 2 is 2.5, right? So that 2.5, so there's no half computer, so it's going to round it up. So 5 divided by 2 will give us 2.5, round it up to 3. 3 plus 1 equals 4. Now that means we need at least 4 computers to make a quorum, but that's not really realistic, in the sense that means out of 5 computers, if one goes down, then we're not in a good shape. Sorry, if 2 goes down, then we're not in a good shape. But we have 5 computers, right? Ideally we should be fine with 3. So to mitigate that, there are other options that are available. So for example, let's say the file share. So we have the file share. So file share is just like a folder that you have designated to have a vote in the quorum, right? So you have a file share, maybe on your desktop you created a folder and you designated it to be a quorum. So if you have 3 computers, ideally 3 should not work in this configuration, because we need 4 minimum, right? But if you have 3, you can still continue, provided you've added this file share that now has a vote to complete that 4, right? That's basically what it's saying. It's a simple concept, but sometimes might be daunting, especially when you're hearing it for the first time. Moving on to types of quorum configuration and their recommendation. So I've taken this screenshot from Microsoft website, TechNet, and basically just bear in mind that you can either have node majority or node and something majority. So that something could be disk or file share, right? So you have an option. So how do you make a decision when to use node majority or node and disk or node and file share majority? So that's basically what this part is trying to teach you. So if you have odd number of nodes, so if let's say you have 3 computers added to the cluster, then the quorum recommendation will be node majority. So any odd number will be node majority. If your quorum, if your configuration is even number of nodes, so you have 2 options. It's either you go for node and disk majority or node and file share majority. So that buttresses what I was explaining earlier, that rather than having your cluster go down or be inconsistent just because you have 2 computers gone out of 5, right? Meanwhile, based on the configuration, you require half of that plus 1 to be in a consistent state. If 2 goes down and you're left with 3 out of 5, then that's not good enough for the cluster to make a quorum. So to avoid that, you can then add a disk to have a vote or a file share to have a vote. I really do hope that this is making sense to you, right? So if what you have is even number of nodes, right, you can then have this node and disk majority. Yeah, if it's even number of nodes, multi-site cluster. Okay, multi-site cluster. So what do we mean by multi-site cluster? Multi-site is when most times with always on, you have your primary and secondary in the same domain controller, and then you have another node in another domain controller which will be serving as the disaster recovery node, so that if anything happens in domain controller A, you can easily switch on over to domain controller B. So this is a multi-site configuration. That's when node and file share majority is recommended by Microsoft. But if it's not a multi-site like we have here, then you can use node and disk majority, right? So that there's a little more you may want to go and read up on this subject to have clearer understanding, but on a very surface level, this should be good enough to get you going. Now, if you have even number of nodes and no shared storage, you can also use node and file share majority, which is also what happens with always on availability group. So we don't have any shared storage. Each of the nodes will have their own storage. So node and file share majority is the recommended quorum setting as well. So just to make a little bit of clarity here, I know I've been using the example of 5 and like we had here. I was using this example, ideally if you have 5 nodes in a cluster, you wouldn't even consider node and file or node and disk. What you will go for is node majority. So just to clarify that, this was just an example to explain the concept, right? So if you have 5 nodes, always remember odd number of nodes, just go for node majority. All right. Right, so let me quickly show you what happens. We turned down the secondary server before. Let me quickly show you what happens when we bring it back up. On the cluster console, I've gone to the node section, and as you can see, you have primary up, secondary down. So let me bring up the secondary node. Yep, secondary, play, and let's watch in real time what happens. So I'm just on purpose going to leave this without pausing. Take note of what's going to be happening here on the secondary. Secondary server is still coming up. Let's quickly have a look. Okay, so it's still coming up. As you can see, it has now changed to joining. So now that it's up, it's trying to join. And now it's up. So this is just to demonstrate what happens when you've now gone to fix what the problem was before the server went down. Now it's back up. What happens? You don't have to do anything. It automatically joins the cluster and so on. So you can practice this on your own as well. So based on the plan we had for this session, this is the only thing we haven't done, but the time is far spent now. So I'm gonna stop the recording right now and move on to the next video, and we will do this in the next video. All right, see you in the next video.